Let's make it even more insightful by welcoming our first speaker for the session, which is Mr. Mark Khan, who is the managing partner Omnivore and is going to speak about managing the balance between productivity and sustainability in agritech. Over to you, Mark.
Great to be here, everyone. As per my introduction, my name is Mark Khan. I'm a managing partner of Omnivore. We have been operating in India's agritech space for over a decade. We are the most active investor in the space, and for many, many years now have been working on the transformation of Indian agriculture and food systems. It's a pleasure to be chatting with everyone today here at NASTech 2021. I was asked to talk about balancing productivity and sustainability in Indian agriculture and agritech. And so as we dive into that, I want to bring everyone onto the same page. I want everyone to understand when we're talking about Indian agriculture, what this ecosystem is all about. And people come with different understandings and preconceptions and misconceptions about Indian agriculture. So let's start with some basics. The first thing is that Indian agriculture is massive. It is one of the world's largest agricultural ecosystems. We have a total market size, a TAM, if you will, of over $500 billion. Ag represents about a fifth of India's GDP. It employs slightly less than half the population. And by most estimates, we have about 130 million, 13 crore farmers in this system. So the first thing to understand, it's really big. There's a lot of people in it. But the corollary to that is that India is one of the largest producers, commodity by commodity, of almost everything that mankind requires, right? India is the world's largest producer of milk. It is the world's largest producer of cotton, the largest in pulses and spices. And then when you take, those commodities where we are second place, it's practically everything. It's rice, it's wheat, it's sugar behind Brazil, fruits and vegetables and tea. So India, despite having a massive number of farmers and very, very small farmers by global standards, right? An average farm holding of about a hectare, that aggregates into India being an agricultural powerhouse. It's not necessarily the way we've always been taught to think about it. We've always been taught to think that, Indian agriculture is lots and lots of poor farmers and constantly struggling. But probably the biggest change in your lifetimes has been India going from being a food importer to being a net food exporter. And I think that's an important thing to understand. India is now a top global exporter of rice, of seafood, especially shrimp. India is the world's largest shrimp exporter, of buffalo meat. That's something that no one really advertises, of spices, of cotton, oil seeds and meals and sugar. The only thing we really import are edible oils, because we have a structural deficit there, and pulses sometimes. And the Zespri kiwi that you get, at a retailer doesn't really figure into a big economic impact. So while for sure there are some specialty fruits and vegetables and imported food products, India, for the most part, right, is basically food secure. It's one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. And in the last 20 years has become a net food exporter. And that's a very important change, because a lot of what you think about in our agricultural economy and our agricultural policy was really oriented towards the deficits and, right, the green revolution mentality, which said that, India was desperately food insecure. And so we have a lot of those legacy policies today that the government quite correctly is now changing, recognizing that India is increasingly going to be focused on agricultural exports. And unlike in the past, where we had a problem of scarcity, right now, what Indian farmers face is a problem of excess production, of plenty. Let's go to the next slide. So a TAM of north of $500 billion. And when our good friends at McKinsey looked at this, they said, actually, Indian agriculture over the course of the next 9 or 10 years can go from $520 billion to $670 billion, with 4 major drivers of that change. One, as I was just saying, is exports, right? Indian agriculture has huge upside in areas like aquaculture, pulses, horticulture, and dairy. But the other areas are all around this space of agri-tech. Precision agriculture can create about $35 billion of value. E-marketplaces can create about $35 billion of value. And digital farmer financing is a huge opportunity. So we are looking at a possibility over the next, say, 10 years of building this into a $700 billion agricultural economy. But, this is a big but, the Indian agriculture sector struggles with multiple structural problems. And if we were to distill that, if we were to say, okay, what are the big 6? What are the largest problems we face? The first is low farmer incomes. Our farmers, as mentioned, own an average of 1.1 hectares of land, which means that no matter how much you produce, you're really falling into structural poverty with a land holding that small. And let's be very clear, your average Indian farmer is not entirely dependent on agricultural income, right? So it's not just the crops they're growing. Most have some amount of livestock, which creates, right, more frequent payments because, for example, if you're doing dairying, you're getting paid every 2 weeks. Most also have, right, some amount of income either in the form of wages, right, or in the form of salaries for other family members, because we're talking about joint families for the most part. So, but there is a structural income challenge. The second is the water crisis, and I think we all live this. Everyone in urban India understands that we have a water problem in this country. This is probably the biggest bottleneck to India becoming a global superpower in agriculture, right? Less than 50% of our cropped area is irrigated, which means our farmers are vulnerable to drought and to the challenge of climate change. And groundwater resources have declined by 60% in the last decade, right? We're essentially pumping much more out of the ground than we have in it, and that's not sustainable, right? We also have, a significant challenge of weak productivity, right? So we've got poor farming practices and environmental stresses that result in farm yields that are a third to half lower than global benchmarks. And let's be clear, productivity is not a panacea, right? For a long time, that kind of green revolution mentality stayed with us, which said, well, okay, our farmers don't produce enough, so if they just produce more, that's the answer. Well, let's just imagine, if you will, right, the farmers of Karnataka doubling their tomato yields overnight. And all of a sudden, we have twice as many tomatoes as we used to in Karnataka. What do you think would happen? Well, the answer is prices would crash and tomatoes would be dumped on highways. And, you're no better off than you are before because you can't produce more until you can actually market more. And if you're trying to market, that means you need to either do value addition and process something, otherwise it perishes, or find new markets for that, like exports. So productivity is never a panacea. It should be part of the equation, but it's not the whole solution. We have incredibly fragmented supply chains. So nearly 90% of our crops flow through a hyper-fragmented supply chain with 15 million organized actors. These are traders, brokers, artiyas, who all capture value, who all take their little bites from the value that should go to smallholder farmers. We have very poor infrastructure. Farm mechanization levels remain below 50%, despite the fact that India is the world's largest market for tractors. And there is massive wastage in this system of about 40% of harvested food crops, obviously higher in horticulture, less in grain, due to insufficient logistics infrastructure, whether that's warehouses, cold storage, or trucking. And there's insufficient credit. So despite huge efforts of NABARD and tremendous gains, to be clear, made in the last 30 years, nearly 60% of the smallholder farmers lack access to institutional credit, and they borrow from money lenders at absolutely extortionary rates. So That's a summary of the problems, if you will. And of course, there are many, many others. There's a problem of soil, right? There are many challenges that this ecosystem faces. When we really distill what we're doing at Omnivore, what our portfolios or companies are doing, the future that we look at ahead of us, we believe that four major things have to change to build a future in Indian agriculture, right? In order to drive agricultural prosperity, in order to transform food systems and promote climate sustainability, there are four major pillars to the future. The first is increasing smallholder profitability. And you will notice I did not say, as I mentioned earlier, smallholder productivity. Every Indian farmer needs to be thought of as a micro entrepreneur, some bigger than others. And that means that, like any entrepreneurial business, they have a balance sheet, and they have an income statement. And that income statement, right, has components to it, right? Many people here have worked in finance. You know how to think about reading an income statement. What is revenue? Revenue is volume by price, you know? And what are profits? Profits are revenue, right, minus expenses. And so how do we think about increasing the profitability of smallholder farmers as opposed to just their productivity? So that, of course, means increasing their volumes, which means raising farm yields. But it also means securing better prices for the same farm output. So even if they're not changing their production, how do we get them paid more for the same amount? And it also means reducing their farm expenditures, right? Too often, smallholder farmers are paying too much for crop nutrition, for crop protection, for the insecticides and agrochemicals that they use. How do we change that to go to their bottom line? How do we reduce their cost of financing to go to their bottom line? We're not just thinking about EBITDA, we're thinking about PBIT. How do we make the profit of these farmers higher? The second area that we think about is enhancing smallholder resilience. And I like to think of that mathematically. I always think of that as the standard deviation of income, the VAR of income. How do we reduce that? Because the challenge in Indian agriculture is not just absolute low profitability in any given moment. It's that over the course of, say, a 5-year period, you see your incomes crash 2 or 3 times. So there's no stability. The stability that we count on as salary owners, as people who receive salaries, right? As employees, right? That kind of stability is utterly lacking for smallholder farmers. And so we think about resilience being something that has to be built. And that means providing access to innovative finance, right, that smooths out their incomes, to risk management solutions that helps avoid, right, challenges in commodity prices, to steady and augmented sources of incomes where you're selling every year to the same food processor as opposed to, bringing whatever you have to the mandi and struggling to get a good price, and improving the market dynamics, right, getting better prices. And so resilience is the second pillar that we believe is required. The third pillar is agricultural sustainability. And that's not just at a farmer level, that's at a systemic level. Because unless we optimize the consumption of natural resources and farm inputs, including water, this system is going to fall apart in 10 or 20 years, right? This is going to be some Mad Max dystopian mess. And so we have to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're using. We have to reduce the amount of chemicals we're using. We have to reduce the amount of water we're using. And on the other side of the equation, we have to minimize the wastage and spoilage. If we're looking at losses of 40%, all we have to do is plug those holes, and our system has significantly more food to eat. And so that sustainability side of the equation is critical. And finally, we used to think of climate action as being part of sustainability. Now we kind of call it out separately because it is so critical. And India is on both sides of the climate challenge. Agriculture represents about 20% of Indian climate GHG emissions. So we're a big GHG emitter, and a big chunk of that is coming from agriculture. But India is also incredibly vulnerable to climate change. It's not Siberia, it's not Canada. right? We're not going to be able to plant more because of climate change. Climate change is going to, erode the amount of area that we can cultivate. It's going to make it too hot to farm outside. And so we have to look at promoting climate resilience for our food system and increasing the area under sustainable and regenerative cultivation. So that's kind of how we look high level at this system. And we're at a really interesting moment right now. When we started Omnivore, some of these trends were more nascent, but technological, social, and entrepreneurial trends are radically accelerating change in India's agriculture sector. And we like to think of that as tech, society, and entrepreneurship, TSE. So what is changing in tech? Well, smartphone penetration in rural India has crossed 40%. That's a big, big change. We have some of the lowest data prices in the world and pretty much ubiquitous 4G. When we started, that was not true. And the kinds of companies that can attack the challenges in this space have changed. It used to be all boots on the ground. Now you make better apps. You've got over 1.2 billion Indians registered on India Stack. And I can't begin to tell you how critical that digital API infrastructure is for government services, for fintech, for everything that's being built in agri-tech right now. And, as a foreigner who's been based in India for about 15 years, right, I'm always delighted by the UPI. I always tell my family and friends back in America, back in Europe, just how terrible payments are in the West compared to how smooth and efficient they are in India. That whole stack and the agri-stack that the government is working on building is facilitating a direct connect to farmers that was unthinkable even a few years ago. At the same time, we have social changes, right? The way we eat and what we eat are changing. We are eating much more protein, and that's increasing demand for pulses, eggs, fish, meat, and dairy. Our consumption of fruits and vegetables are on an absolute tear, right? Which is good, it's healthy. As incomes rise, people are eating more sabzi, they're eating more fruits. There's a preference towards safe and traceable food that has especially come up, during the challenge of COVID, as people have started paying more attention to what they eat. And despite all that health consciousness, let's be clear, there's still tons of consumption of processed foods, restaurant delivery, and eating outside of your home at levels that were unthinkable 20 years ago. So we have a lot of changes to consumption. And we have a very different entrepreneurial environment, very different from when I moved to India in 2007, very different from when we started Omnivore in 2011, and very different from even 5 years ago. And I like to think of the entrepreneurial side of this being multifaceted. On one hand, right, there is an incredible need for rural entrepreneurship. You have limited job growth, unfortunately, in manufacturing, not enough in services. And so there is a need for micro entrepreneurship for young people in rural India. And people are building businesses recognizing that entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurial opportunity, whether you call them village level entrepreneurs or last mile or what have you, right? There's a lot of rural entrepreneurship at the micro level that's taking off. Farmers are also becoming more entrepreneurial. They're beginning to recognize that, just asking the government to pay them more isn't necessarily resulting in them in getting paid more. And so you're starting to see a lot of income diversification via horticulture, via animal husbandry, aquaculture, sericulture, floriculture. Farmers are saying, how can I diversify my income streams to make more money? And then, of course, we have this incredible startup ecosystem that we all exist in, where, I would say we're, in the going into kind of the third decade of it. But what we see increasingly is that young Indians who grew up in rural India, who then went on to the IITs and the NITs and, or managerial education, and who have great work experience, are beginning to innovate for the world that they were born in, for rural India, for the smaller cities, for the smaller towns, for the villages themselves. And so all of that taken together has resulted in an incredible entrepreneurial environment in agri-tech. And so when we talk about, finding, this balance between productivity and sustainability, I want to talk about a couple examples. Some of these you guys know, some of them you might not, right? Stellaps is an older company in our portfolio, right? And they have built over the course of the last, 8 years, a full stack dairy platform. in India, which includes a data-driven omni-channel marketplace for inputs and services, embedded fintech solutions for member farmers, and increasingly wholesale B2B milk supply with end-to-end digital traceability for anyone that wants to buy high-quality milk in India. There is an incredible amount of milk flowing through this system, and it's reducing milk spoilage everywhere they operate. And I think Stellaps is a wonderful example of what's possible in Indian agri-tech, because the pedigree of these founders are very similar to a lot of the people that are paying attention to my presentation today. This is a team of five folks from Wipro who all had experience in software services and decided to rededicate their lives to transforming rural India. And I think it's a great example, and stay tuned. They've done a huge amount of business. They're just taking off even further, and you'll hear a lot from them in the next 12 months. Deja, they've got a big announcement underway, but they're a full stack farmer platform. And if you think about what Deja does, they do inputs, they do finance, they do market linkages, they do advisory. It's as full stack as you get. They're operating across 10 states. They have over 7 lakh farmers, and they're helping to digitize this entire ecosystem across the inputs, market linkages, fintech, and advisory. And everywhere Deja goes, they bring sustainable agriculture with them. They're helping farmers to use less pesticide. They're helping to bring areas under sustainable cultivation, right? So this whole thing around productivity and sustainability with Deja is going hand in hand, and they've built an incredible cap table of investors that are supporting them as they scale across India. And finally, not as many people are aware of Ariya, but they should be. Ariya is one of the largest post-harvest agri-tech startups in India. So they're working across warehousing, warehouse receipt financing, rural storage, collateral management, and market linkages. They've got over $1 billion of agricultural commodities stored in their system. They have over 3,000 warehouses. They're digitizing another 6,000 as we speak, and they're lending to farmers that are storing in this kind of digital warehouse system. And in the process, helping farmers with their storage solution radically reduce food waste and radically reduce GHG emissions. And I bring these 3 companies up. These are all companies that are kind of vintage 2013 that have begun to get some very serious traction, some very serious scale, as a sign of where this system is going. They're obviously younger startups. They're obviously startups tackling different problems. But I firmly believe that what we're seeing is this challenge of productivity and sustainability being tackled, right, by increasingly increasingly large scale startups. And I really think in the next few years, you're going to see the transformation of rural India because of what folks in the agri-tech sector are doing. So it's been a pleasure presenting here today. I hope everyone here starts to pay more attention to agri-tech if you're not already. And please reach out if you want to talk more about this. Thank you very much.
Wow, in fact, that was truly eye-opening. And as a matter of fact, it was also a moment of feel good for multiple Indians who have been watching this live. Thanks so much, Mark, once again for showing us the way forward for a sustainable future as far as agriculture in India is concerned.